There's a phase every empath goes through that feels almost like a curse. You walk into a room and instantly feel everything: tension, insecurity, hidden resentment, unspoken sadness, and none of it belongs to you. Yet somehow it becomes yours. You carry it, process it, and often try to fix it. For a long time, this feels like compassion. It feels like connection. But in reality, it's a lack of separation. It's the absence of a boundary between where you end and someone else begins. And this is where the transformation starts. A healed empath doesn't lose their sensitivity. That's the common misconception. They don't become cold, detached, or indifferent. What changes is far more precise and far more powerful. They develop what you could call emotional authority. Not control over others, but control over their relationship to what they feel. Before healing, empathy is reactive. It's automatic. Someone is anxious and your body mirrors it. Someone is angry and your nervous system absorbs it. You don't choose this. It happens instantly, below conscious awareness. And because it feels so real, you assume it must be yours to deal with. So you step in, you soothe, you fix, you overextend. And slowly, without realizing it, you build a life where your internal state is dictated by external people. But healing interrupts that pattern. It introduces a pause, a small but critical gap between what you feel and what you do with it. And in that gap, something new emerges: discernment. You begin to recognize that feeling something doesn't automatically mean you have to carry it. You can witness without absorbing. You can understand without internalizing. This is not detachment in the unhealthy sense, it's clarity. Think about the difference between standing in a storm and watching one through a window. Before healing, you're in the storm. Every emotional shift around you hits directly. After healing, the storm doesn't disappear. You just step out of it. You can still see it, you can still understand its intensity, but you're no longer being battered by it. And that changes everything. Because once you stop absorbing, you stop reacting impulsively. You stop trying to manage other people's emotions as a way to regulate your own. You
start asking better questions. Is this mine? Becomes a filter. Am I responsible for this? Becomes a boundary. And most importantly, what is the appropriate response here? Replaces the old instinct of immediate emotional labor. This is where empathy evolves from a burden into a skill. A healed empath can walk into that same room, feel the same tension, and not be controlled by it. They can read the emotional landscape with accuracy, but instead of merging with it, they analyze it. They choose how to engage, if at all. And that choice is where their power lies. Because when you're no longer overwhelmed, you become strategic. You start to notice patterns you couldn't see before. You recognize when someone is projecting, when someone is seeking validation, when someone is testing boundaries. And instead of reacting emotionally, you respond intentionally. Sometimes that response is compassion. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's distance. But it's always chosen, not triggered. This shift also changes how people experience you. Before, others might have been drawn to your openness, but they also sensed your availability or willingness to take on more than you should. And whether consciously or unconsciously, people tend to lean into that. After healing, that dynamic changes. You're still empathetic, but there's a structure to it. There's a presence that says, I understand you, but I'm not here to carry you. And that creates respect, not because you demand it loudly, but because your energy communicates it clearly. There's a steadiness to you, a groundedness. You're no longer easily pulled into emotional chaos, and that makes you both more effective and more selective in how you engage. It's important to understand that this doesn't happen overnight.
For many empaths, this shift feels uncomfortable at first. There's guilt. There's a sense of I should be doing more. That's because your identity has been built around being the one who absorbs, who fixes, who gives endlessly. Letting go of that role can feel like losing a part of yourself. But what you're actually losing is the part that was unsustainable. What replaces it is something far more stable. You begin to realize that true empathy isn't about self-sacrifice. It's about accurate understanding combined with appropriate action. And sometimes the most appropriate action is to do nothing, to allow others to experience their own emotions without interference. This is where emotional authority fully takes hold. You're no longer at the mercy of every emotional signal around you. You become the filter, the interpreter, the decision maker. Your empathy becomes intentional rather than automatic. And because of that, it becomes far more impactful. When you do choose to engage, it's focused, it's measured, it's effective. You're not drained at the end of the day. You're not overwhelmed by interactions. You're not carrying conversations in your mind long after they've ended. You move through environments with awareness, but also with protection. Not walls, just clarity about what belongs to you and what doesn't. And once you reach this point, something subtle but profound happens. You stop fearing your own sensitivity. You stop seeing it as something that makes you vulnerable. Instead, you recognize it as a form of intelligence, one that, when disciplined, gives you insight most people never develop. You don't shut off your empathy.
You refine it, and that refinement is what turns it from something that once controlled you into something that now works for you. Because the moment you realize you can feel everything without carrying anything is the moment you stop being overwhelmed by the world and start understanding it. There's a moment in an empath's life where they begin to realize that what they once called kindness was in many cases a lack of boundaries. Not intentional, not malicious, just unexamined. They gave because it felt right. They tolerated because they understood. They stayed because they could see the pain behind someone's behavior. And for a long time, that felt like strength. But over time, the pattern reveals its cost. When you operate without clear boundaries, your identity becomes shaped by other people's expectations. You start anticipating needs that were never expressed. You start saying yes before you've even checked in with yourself. And perhaps most importantly, you start believing that your value is tied to how much you can endure, how much you can give, and how much you can fix. Healing disrupts that belief system at its core. A healed empath comes to a very uncomfortable realization. Love without boundaries is not noble, but self-erasure. It creates relationships where one person is consistently overextended and the other becomes often unintentionally dependent on that overextension. And the longer that dynamic continues, the harder it becomes to break because it starts to feel like identity. This is just who I am, but it isn't who you are. It's what you've practiced, and what's been practiced can be changed.
The kind that isn't disrupted by every interaction, the kind that allows you to move through life without being pulled in multiple emotional directions at once. That is what selective connection creates. And at its highest expression, this is not loneliness, it is sovereignty. Because sovereignty is not about being separate from others, it's about not being internally dependent on their presence to feel stable. It's the ability to be fully yourself, whether you are alone or with others, without fragmentation. A healed empath reaches that point not by closing off, but by refining access. Not by rejecting connection, but by choosing it deliberately. Not by withdrawing from life, but by stepping out of emotional chaos and into intentional engagement. And when that happens, something becomes very clear. They are no longer trying to find where they belong. They are deciding where they will allow themselves to be fully present. And that changes everything. Because once you stop needing connection to define you, you finally gain the freedom to choose it in its most honest form. That is where real